300 pounds of fear stood trembling on the wooden platform of the Purgatory Springs train station. Marianne Higgins clutched a crumpled letter in her sweating palm, the ink smudged by anxiety. She wasn't just afraid of the wild, lawless Montana territory. She was terrified of the man coming to claim her. They called him the Butcher of Bear Ridge, a mountain man with a temper so vile he'd allegedly killed a man with his bare hands. But Marianne had a secret, too, one she couldn't hide under corsets or lace. She was the fat girl no one wanted. When the giant shadow fell over her, she braced for the disgust in his eyes. Instead, she found a deception so deep it would threaten to burn the entire mountain down. Dust coated the back of Marianne's throat, tasting of iron and despair. The Union Pacific locomotive hissed steam like a dying dragon, its metal groans echoing off the red canyon walls that surrounded the desolate town of Purgatory Springs. It was 1887, and the world had no kindness for a woman of her size. Marianne Higgins remained in her seat as the other passengers, lean prospectors, sharp-eyed gamblers, and weary mothers scrambled for the exits. The wicker seat creaked ominously under her shifting weight, a sound that made heat flush up her neck, staining her cheeks crimson. It was a familiar humiliation. In Boston, she had been the Higgins elephant, the spinster daughter of a baker who ate the profits. Her father had been cruel, but the silence of the spinsterhood that awaited her was crueler. That was why she had answered the advertisement. Wanted. Wife for solitary life in high country. Must be sturdy. Must not fear silence. Right to be. Calloway. She hadn't sent a photograph. It was a lie of omission that had gnawed at her gut for the entirety of the 2-week journey west. She had described herself as strong and capable of heavy lifting. She hadn't mentioned that her ankles swelled after standing too long, or that finding a dress to fit her 30-inch waist required custom tailoring she could rarely afford. She wore her best traveling gown now, a dark blue serge that was painfully tight across her bosom and hips, the fabric straining to contain her. "Last stop, ma'am," the conductor barked from the aisle. He didn't look her in the eye. Men rarely did. They looked past her. Or worse, they looked at her with a mixture of pity and revulsion. "Thank you," she whispered, grabbing her carpet bag. Stepping off the train was a logistical nightmare. The stairs were steep and narrow. She had to turn sideways, gripping the rail until her knuckles turned white, praying the wood wouldn't splinter. When her boots finally hit the dusty planks of the platform, she felt the eyes of the town on her. Purgatory Springs was a scar on the land, a collection of hastily erected false front buildings, a saloon that smelled of stale beer, even from here, and a livery stable buzzing with flies. But it was the silence that chilled her. She stood by her trunk, a solitary, massive figure in the midday sun. She waited. 10 minutes passed. Then 20. The panic set in. He saw me, she thought, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. He saw me from a distance, saw that I am twice the size of a normal woman, and he rode away. It wouldn't be the first time. She pulled the letter from her reticule for the 100th time. The handwriting was jagged, aggressive. "I will meet you at the platform at noon. Look for the gray mare. You waitin' for Boone?" The voice was like gravel, grinding in a churn. Marianne spun around, nearly losing her balance. A man stood leaning against a support post. He was older, missing an ear, with tobacco juice staining his white beard. I am waiting for Mr. Calloway," she corrected, trying to muster the dignity of a Boston lady. The old man spat on the tracks. "Mr. Calloway," he chuckled darkly. "That's a polite way to name the devil. You must be the mail-order bride. We had a pool going at the saloon. I bet on Runaway, but looks like I lost. You're big enough to stay put." Marianne stiffened. "Is he coming?" "Oh, he's here," the man said, pointing a gnarled finger toward the end of the street. "But if you're smart, girl, you'll get back on that train when it loops around tomorrow." Boone Calloway don't want a wife. He wants a victim. They say he screamed his last housekeeper deaf before she ran off into the snow. Marianne's blood ran cold. The letters had been brief, businesslike, but never cruel. The demon temper. Was that why he had to order a wife from 3,000 miles away? A hush fell over the station platform. The loungers and loafers straightened up, eyes averting to the ground. The change in atmosphere was instant. Like the pressure drop before a tornado, a horse turned the corner. It was a massive gray Percheron, a draft horse that looked more like a war machine than a riding animal. And on its back sat a mountain of a man. Boone Calloway. He was terrifying. That was the only word for it. He wore a duster coat made of bear hide that added to his already immense bulk. A wide-brimmed hat shadowed his face, but a thick, unruly black beard flowed down to his chest. He didn't ride with the swagger of a cowboy. He rode with the heavy, impending doom of a landslide. He pulled the horse to a stop in front of the platform. The animal snorted, pawing the ground. Boone didn't dismount. He just sat there, looking down. Marianne felt small for the first time in her life. Not physically, she was 5'8" and broad, but spiritually shrinking under his gaze. He pushed his hat back with a thumb. His eyes were the color of flint, hard and unreadable. They swept over her, starting at her boots, traveling up the expanse of her blue dress, lingering on the tightness of the sleeves, the fullness of her face, the double chin she tried desperately to hide by tilting her head up. The silence stretched, agonizing and thick. The town watched. The old man with one ear smirked. Boone Calloway cleared his throat. It sounded like a rock slide. "You Marianne?" "I am," she squeaked, then cleared her throat and said it louder. "I am Marianne Higgins. You're bigger than I figured," he said flatly. The words were a slap. Tears pricked her eyes, hot and sudden. She gripped her bag, her knuckles aching. "And you are ruder than I expected, Mr. Calloway. If you wish to send me back, say so now. I will not be ogled like a prize hog at the county fair." A ripple of shock went through the bystanders. No one spoke to Boone Calloway like that. Not if they wanted to keep their teeth. Boone stared at her. For a second, his eyes narrowed. Then, a strange expression flickered across his face. It wasn't anger. It looked almost like relief. "Get your trunk," he grunted. "Wagon's round back. We're burning daylight." The ride up the mountain was an exercise in terror and physical discomfort. The wagon was a buckboard with rusted springs that groaned in protest every time they hit a rut. Marianne sat on the hard wooden bench next to Boone, their shoulders brushing with every lurch. He smelled of pine resin, wood smoke, and old leather. It wasn't an unpleasant smell, but it was overpowering, invading her senses. He hadn't spoken a word since they left Purgatory Springs. He drove the horses with an effortless, casual strength, his large hands holding the reins loosely. Marianne stole glances at him from beneath the brim of her bonnet. Up close, the demon looked even more formidable. A jagged white scar ran from his temple into his hairline, disappearing into the thick black thatch. His profile was sharp, his nose crooked as if it had been broken once and set poorly. "The town," Marianne ventured after 2 hours of silence, her voice trembling slightly. "The man at the station. He said people are afraid of you." Boone didn't look at her. "People talk too much. Wind blows through their empty heads and makes noise. He said you have a temper." Boone snapped the reins. "I like my privacy. If getting mad keeps fools off my land, then I'm mad." "And am I a fool?" she asked. He finally looked at her then. The intensity of his gaze made her breath hitch. "You're here, aren't you? We'll see." It wasn't an answer. It was a challenge. The road grew steeper, winding up into the Bighorn foothills. The air thinned, becoming crisp and smelling of spruce. The temperature dropped. Marianne shivered in her thin Boston coat. Without a word, Boone reached behind the seat. He pulled out a rough wool blanket tartan, frayed at the edges, and tossed it into her lap. "Cover up," he commanded. Freezing to death is a breach of contract. She wrapped the scratchy wool around her shoulders, surprised by the warmth it held. "Thank you. Don't thank me. Just practical." Hard to dig a grave in this rocky soil. She couldn't tell if he was joking. His face remained as stony as the cliffs they passed. They arrived at the cabin just as the sun began to dip behind the peaks, painting the sky in violent shades of violet and bruised orange. It wasn't the shack she had feared. It was a sturdy, sprawling structure made of massive logs, chinked with white clay. Smoke curled lazily from a stone chimney. A barn stood to the side, equally well built. It was isolated. There wasn't another light or structure for miles. She was completely alone with him. Boone brought the wagon to a halt. "Home," he grunted. He jumped down, the ground thumping under his boots. He walked around to her side. The drop from the wagon seat was high. Usually, she had to struggle, stepping on the wheel hubs, risking a fall that would be catastrophic for a woman of her weight. She hesitated, looking at the ground. "Well?" Boone demanded. "It is." "High," she admitted, shame coloring her cheeks. Boone stepped closer. He reached up. "Jump, Mr. Calloway." "I cannot simply jump. I am heavy. I will hurt you." "Woman," he growled, a flash of that rumored temper sparking in his eyes. "I haul elk carcasses heavier than you out of these woods on my back. Now get down here before the wolves start howling." She closed her eyes and slid off the seat. She expected to hit the ground hard. She expected him to buckle, to grunt with the effort, to drop her. Instead, strong hands gripped her waist. For a fleeting second, she was suspended in the air, held by a strength that seemed impossible. He lowered her slowly, his grip firm but surprisingly controlled. Her boots touched the dirt. She was standing chest to chest with him. She could feel the heat radiating from his body. She looked up, startled. His hands were still on her waist, spanning the width of her, sinking slightly into the soft flesh she despised. He didn't pull away immediately. He looked down at her, his brow furrowed, as if he were trying to solve a puzzle. "You're cold," he said, his voice dropping an octave. Yes." He released her abruptly and turned to the back of the wagon to grab her heavy trunk. He hoisted it onto one shoulder as if it were filled with feathers. "Inside. Stew's on the stove. Don't touch the rifle by the door." Mary Ann hurried up the steps, her heart racing. He hadn't made a comment. He hadn't groaned when he lifted her. She pushed open the heavy oak door and stepped into her new life. The interior was shocking. She expected filth. She expected a bachelor's sty. Instead, the main room was meticulously clean. The floorboards were swept. There was a large braided rug in front of the hearth. A fire crackled warmly. But what caught her eye was the furniture. The chairs were oversized. The table was massive, hewn from thick slabs of oak. Everything was built to a scale that made sense for a giant like Boone. And for the first time in her adult life, Mary Ann realized she was standing in a room where she didn't feel too big. Boone kicked the door shut behind him, dropping the trunk with a thud. He locked the door, sliding a heavy iron bolt into place. Then he turned to face her, the firelight casting long, dancing shadows across his scarred face. "Rules?" he said, peeling off his bear hide coat. "Number 1, you don't go into the locked room in the cellar. Number 2, you don't ask about my business in town. Number 3, when the sun goes down, the shutters stay closed." "Why?" Mary Ann asked, her curiosity overriding her fear. Boone walked to the window, peering out into the darkening forest. His hand rested on the pistol, holstered at his hip. "Because," he whispered, "there are things on this mountain worse than a bad temper, and they've been waiting for me to make a mistake." He turned back to her, and for a moment, the hardness in his eyes cracked, revealing a deep, haunted exhaustion. "Supper's in the pot. Eat. I have rounds to make." He went back out into the dark, leaving her alone in the strange, oversized house. the smell of savory beef stew mingling with the scent of her own fear. She walked to the window, peeking through a crack in the shutter. Outside, in the blue twilight, she saw Boone patrolling the perimeter of the clearing. He had a Winchester rifle in his hands. He wasn't looking at the livestock. He was watching the tree line, like a soldier expecting an invasion. Mary Ann Higgins realized then that the demon temper might be a lie, but the danger was very, very real. She hadn't married a monster. She had married a man under siege. The first week at the Calloway cabin was a lesson in scale. Mary Ann had spent her life shrinking, pulling in her elbows, tucking in her chin, stepping softly so the floorboards wouldn't creak. She was used to a world built for smaller people, a world where she was an imposition. But Boone's world was different. The morning after her arrival, Mary Ann woke before dawn. The silence of the mountain was absolute, heavy enough to weigh on her chest. She dressed in the dark, her fingers fumbling with the laces of her corset, though she left it looser than usual. Who was there to impress? She went to the kitchen to start breakfast. She expected to struggle. In her father's bakery, the aisles were narrow, and her hips had always bumped the flour sacks. Here, the space between the table and the stove was a wide canyon. The cast-iron skillet hanging on the wall was enormous, heavy enough to break a wrist, but suited for a hand twice the size of hers. She cooked. It was the one thing she knew she could do well. She made biscuits, rolling the dough with a heavy glass bottle she found, and fried thick slabs of salt pork. When Boone entered from the barn, bringing a gust of cold air and the scent of horses with him, he stopped in the doorway. He looked at the table set for two. He looked at the steaming biscuits. "I didn't hire a cook," he grunted, moving to the basin to wash his hands. He scrubbed his face vigorously, water dripping into his beard. "You hired a wife, Mr. Calloway," Mary Ann said, her voice steadier than the day before. "And wives cook. Unless you prefer charred meat and silence?" Boone paused, the towel in his hands. He looked at her, his dark eyes narrowing. "Silence has its virtues." He sat down. The chair didn't groan. Mary Ann sat opposite him. For the first time, her thighs didn't feel pinched between the armrests. The furniture was so large it made her feel petite. It was a dizzying sensation. Boone ate with the efficiency of a wolf, but he wasn't messy. When he finished the third biscuit, he wiped his mouth. "Light," he said. "Pardon?" "The biscuits. They're light, like air." He looked at her hands, resting on the table hands she usually hid because they were fleshy and dimpled. Good hands. Mary Ann felt a flush rise from her neck. A compliment on her utility was rare. A compliment on her physical self was unprecedented. But the peace didn't last. 2 days later, the accident happened. Mary Ann was sweeping the main room. She was moving a heavy clay jug of water that Boone kept by the door. Her palms were sweaty, and the glaze was slick. The jug slipped. It hit the floor with a sound like a gunshot. Water exploded across the room, soaking the rug. The heavy stoneware shattered into 100 sharp shards. Mary Ann froze. Her heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs. "This is it," she thought, squeezing her eyes shut. "This is the demon temper." She remembered her father's rage over a spilt sack of sugar, the shouting, the insults about her clumsiness, her size. He will say, "I am a clumsy cow." He will hit me. The door banged open. Boone stood there, his chest heaving, his rifle in hand. He had been chopping wood outside. "What happened?" he roared, his voice filling the cabin. Mary Ann dropped to her knees, heedless of the water soaking her dress. She began frantically gathering the sharp shards with her bare hands. "I'm sorry. I'm so clumsy. I'm sorry. Please don't." "Stop." Boone crossed the room in 2 strides. He didn't strike her. He dropped the rifle and grabbed her wrists, pulling her hands away from the broken pottery. "Look at you," he barked. Mary Ann flinched, waiting for the blow. "You're bleeding, woman." She looked down. In her panic, she had sliced her thumb on a shard, a drop of bright red blood welled up. Boone didn't look at the broken jug. He didn't look at the water ruining his rug. He was staring at her hand with an intensity that looked like pain. He pulled a handkerchief from his pocket, surprisingly clean, and pressed it to her thumb. The jug," she stammered, tears spilling over. "I'll pay for it. I have a little money hidden." "To hell with the jug," Boone growled. He lifted her effortlessly to her feet, his hands gripping her elbows to steady her. "It's clay. Clay is dirt. Blood is life. Why are you shaking?" "I thought you would be angry," she whispered, looking up at him. "They said, the temper." Boone released her, stepping back as if burned. He ran a hand through his thick hair, turning away. "I don't hit women, Marianne, and I don't yell over spilled water." He grabbed a broom. "Sit down. I'll clean it. If you cut yourself again, I'll have to stitch it. And I've got hands for shoeing horses, not sewing skin." Marianne sat, watching the massive man gently sweep the shards into a dustpan. He wasn't the monster the town had painted. He was rough, yes. He was loud. But as he worked, she realized the demon temper wasn't rage. It was a wall built to keep the world out. But why? The answer came on a Tuesday, 3 weeks after her arrival. Marianne was in the garden patch behind the house, struggling to pull up stubborn roots. She wore one of Boone's old work shirts over her dress to protect it. It was the only thing big enough to cover her ample bosom without restricting her movement. The sound of hooves drew her attention. She stood up, wiping sweat from her forehead with the back of her arm. 3 riders were coming up the trail. They weren't Boone. Boone was checking the trap lines up on the North Ridge. The lead rider was a man in a pristine gray suit, an absurdity in the wilderness. He rode a black stallion with silver tack. He was thin, with a face like a hatchet and eyes that looked like wet stones. This was Cornelius Pike. They pulled up to the garden fence. Pike looked Marianne up and down, his lip curling in a sneer that Marianne knew well. It was the look of a man who measured worth in inches and pounds. Well, Pike drawled. "We heard the bear of the mountain got himself a pet. Didn't realize he bought cattle, too." The men behind him laughed. Marianne stood tall, clutching her hoe like a weapon. "Mr. Calloway is not home. State your business and leave." Pike leaned over his saddle horn. "My business is with the land, darlin'. You tell Boone that the offer stands. He sells the water rights to the creek, or we burn him out. He's holding up progress. The railroad needs water, and I own the railroad." He said no, Marianne said firmly. "Now get off this property." Pike laughed, a dry, rattling sound. Feisty for a fat girl. "You know, he only married you to keep the claim lawful. A bachelor on a homestead is vulnerable. A widower, well, that's tragic. But a married man holds the deed tighter. You're just a signature on a paper, sweetheart. A heavy one. At that, he spurred his horse closer, the animal's chest bumping the fence. "Maybe I should teach you some manners before he gets back." A gunshot cracked through the air. Pike's hat flew off his head. A neat hole punched through the crown. Boone stood at the edge of the clearing, his Winchester smoking. He looked like a demon now. His face was twisted in a snarl so primal it made the horses shy away. "Get away from her," Boone roared. The sound echoed off the canyon walls, deeper than thunder. Pike wrestled his horse under control, his face pale. "You missed? Calloway?" "I didn't miss," Boone said, walking forward, the lever of his rifle cranking another round into the chamber with a lethal clack-clack. "Next one takes your ear. The one after that takes your head." He didn't stop until he was standing in front of Marianne, placing his massive body between her and the riders. He was a human shield, broad and immovable. "This is my wife." Boone spat, his voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm register. "You look at her wrong, I break your jaw. You speak to her wrong, I cut out your tongue. You step on her garden again, Pike, and I will bury you in it." Pike glared, his humiliation burning bright red on his neck. "This isn't over, Calloway. You can't fight the whole valley." "Watch me," Boone said. Pike signaled his men, and they wheeled their horses around, galloping back down the trail in a cloud of dust. Boone watched them go until they were out of sight. He didn't relax. His shoulders remained tight, his knuckles white on the rifle. "Boone?" Marianne whispered. He turned to her. The rage vanished, replaced by a frantic inspection. He grabbed her shoulders. "Did they touch you?" "No. They said cruel things." "Lies," Boone said fiercely. "Pike is a snake. He wants the water from the spring up here. It feeds the whole valley, but he wants to dam it, sell it, starve the small farmers out so he can buy their land cheap. I'm the only one stopping him because the source is on my land." He looked into her eyes, and for the first time, Marianne saw the burden he carried. "That's why they call me the butcher," he confessed, his voice rough. 2 years ago, Pike sent a man to burn the barn. I caught him. I beat him bad. I didn't kill him, but he won't walk straight again. They spun the story, made me a monster so no one would side with me. He released her shoulders, his hands lingering for a moment on her arms. "I didn't bring you here to be a signature, Marianne. I brought you here because I was tired of fighting alone. But I never meant to put you in the crossfire." Marianne looked at the scar on his head, the gray in his beard, the weary set of his mouth. "I am not afraid of snakes, Boone," she said softly. "And I am hard to move. Mr. Pike is right about one thing." "What's that?" "I am heavy," she said, stepping closer to him until her chest brushed his. "Too heavy for him to push around, and too heavy for you to carry this load by yourself." The first snow fell in October, a white blanket that sealed the mountain passes. The world shrank down to the cabin, the barn, and the fire. The intimacy was unavoidable. They shared meals. They sat by the fire in the evenings. Boone mended tack. Marianne sewed curtains. The silence between them had changed. It wasn't tense anymore. It was companionable. But the threat of Pike hung over them like an avalanche waiting to trigger. One evening, a blizzard howled outside, shaking the sturdy timbers of the cabin. Boone was restless. He paced the floor, checking the window shutters every 10 minutes. "Something's wrong," he muttered. "The dogs in the barn are barking." "It's just the wind, Boone," Marianne said, looking up from her book. "No, wind sounds different." He grabbed his coat and his rifle. "Bar the door behind me. Don't open it unless you hear my voice." He went out into the swirling white. Marianne waited. 5 minutes. 10. Then, a sound that wasn't the wind. A sharp crack of a rifle, followed by a shout. "Boone!" she screamed. She threw off the bar and flung the door open. The wind nearly knocked her down. Through the driving snow, she saw a dark shape dragging itself through the snow. She ran out, the cold biting through her dress, instantly. It was Boone. He was clutching his thigh, blood staining the snow black in the moonlight. "Get back inside," he grit out, his face gray with pain. "Sniper. Trees. I'm not leaving you." She didn't think. She didn't calculate. Adrenaline surged through her. She grabbed Boone under the arms. He was 250 pounds of dead weight, but Marianne Higgins was the daughter of a baker who hauled flour sacks, and she was a woman fighting for her life. With a grunt that tore from the bottom of her lungs, she dragged him. He tried to help, pushing with his good leg, but she did the heavy lifting. She hauled him up the steps, into the cabin, and kicked the door shut, slamming the bolt home, just as a bullet thudded into the wood from outside. Boone collapsed on the rug. The wound was bad, a clean shot through the meat of his thigh. He was losing blood fast. "The kit?" he gasped. "Cellar. The locked room. Keys in my boot." Marianne didn't hesitate. She fished the iron key from his boot. She lit a lantern and ran to the cellar door. She had obeyed his rule for months, but now, rules didn't matter. She hurried down the stairs and unlocked the forbidden door. She expected to see guns. She expected to see maps, or gold, or the dark secrets of a madman. She raised the lantern. The room was a workshop, but not for war. Every shelf was lined with wood carvings, hundreds of them. They were exquisite. Tiny hummingbirds with delicate wings, sleeping fawns, intricate flowers with petals so thin they looked translucent. And in the center of the room, on a workbench, was a larger piece. It was unfinished, but the shape was clear. It was a woman. She was curvy, with full hips and round arms, her head thrown back in a laugh. It wasn't a caricature. It was a worshipful rendering of a soft, strong body. It was her. He had been carving her, not from a picture, but from memory, from watching her in the kitchen, in the garden. The care and the curves of the wood told a story he had never spoken. Marianne grabbed the medical box from the shelf, her heart aching in her chest. She ran back upstairs. Boone was pale, his eyes fluttering shut. She tore his pant leg open. She cleaned the wound, pouring whiskey over it, binding it tight with strips of her petticoat. "Boone," she said, slapping his cheek lightly. "Stay with me." He groaned, his eyes opening. He looked at her, then at the medical box, and realized where she had been. "You saw," he whispered, shame coloring his voice. "I saw," she said, tears streaming down her face. "Why did you hide it? Why did you hide you?" "Because," he rasped, his hand reaching out to grip hers. His hand was rough, calloused, trembling. "A man like me, a beast, doesn't get to make beautiful things. I didn't want you to know I was soft. Soft gets you killed out here. Soft is what makes you a man, Boone Calloway," she said fiercely. She leaned down and kissed his forehead, then his lips. It was a desperate, salty kiss, tasting of fear and whiskey. "And you are the most beautiful thing I have ever known." Boone stared at her, wonder in his eyes. "Marianne, hush," she commanded. "Pike is out there. He tried to kill you. He'll burn the house next," Boone said, struggling to sit up. "He knows I'm hit. He'll come to finish it. Then we make sure he regrets it," Marianne said. She stood up, her bulk casting a long shadow in the firelight. She walked to the gun rack and pulled down a double-barreled shotgun. She broke it open, checking the shells just as she had seen him do. "You can't," Boone groaned. "Marianne, leave. Take the back trail." "I told you," she said, snapping the shotgun closed. "I am a boulder. I don't move." Outside, a torch flickered in the darkness. Then another. "Come out, Calloway." Pike's voice drifted over the wind. "We know you're bleeding. Send the fat girl out, and we might let her live." Marianne walked to the window. She cracked the shutter. "Boone," she said, her voice steady. "Can you shoot from the floor?" "I can shoot from the grave if I have to," he growled, dragging himself toward his rifle. "Good," she said. "Because I am about to open the door." The heavy oak door swung inward, catching the wind like a sail. Snow swirled into the warm cabin, hissing as it hit the hot iron of the stove. Marianne Higgins stepped onto the porch, the double-barreled shotgun leveled at the darkness. She was a massive silhouette against the firelight, her hair wild, her eyes fierce. She didn't look like the trembling spinster who had arrived at the train station months ago. She looked like the mountain itself, immovable, formidable, and dangerous. "Go home, Pike," she screamed over the howling wind. "There is nothing for you here but a cold grave." Laughter drifted from the tree line. Cornelius Pike stepped into the circle of light cast by the cabin's windows, a torch in one hand and a revolver in the other. Two hired guns flanked him, their faces obscured by scarves. "Look at that," Pike sneered, his voice thin and reedy. "The South thinks she's a soldier. Where's your cripple, Marianne? Bleeding out on the rug?" "He's right where he needs to be," she said, her voice dropping to a low, deadly register that mimicked Boone's. "Don't take another step." Pike took a step. "Burn it down, boys. Roast 'em both." One of the men raised his arm to throw a lit bottle of kerosene. Crack. The bottle shattered in the man's hand, exploding in a ball of blue flame. He screamed, dropping to the snow, rolling frantically to put out the fire on his sleeve. Boone. He had fired through the open door, lying prone on the floorboards, his aim true despite the agony in his leg. "Get her!" Pike shrieked, firing blindly at the doorway. Bullets chewed into the doorframe around Mary Ann. She didn't flinch. She pulled the trigger. The shotgun roared, the recoil slamming into her shoulder like a mule kick. Buckshot tore up the snow at Pike's feet, sending him scrambling back behind a pine tree. Inside. "Now!" Boone roared from the floor. Mary Ann stepped back and slammed the door, throwing the bolt just as a heavy body slammed against it. It was one of the hired hands. He was trying to batter it down. "Window!" Boone shouted. Glass shattered. A gloved hand reached through the broken pane, fumbling for the latch. Mary Ann didn't think. She swung the heavy stock of the shotgun like a club, bringing it down on the intruder's wrist with a sickening crunch. The man outside howled and fell away. But they were surrounded. Smoke began to curl under the door. Pike had thrown the torch onto the porch. The dry wood of the steps was catching. "They're burning us out," Boone rasped, dragging himself to sit against the wall. He reloaded his rifle with trembling hands. "Mary Ann, the cellar. There's a tunnel. It comes out by the creek. Go." "And leave you?" She looked at him, her chest heaving. "You can't crawl that far." "I can hold them off," he said, his eyes pleading. "Please. I didn't marry you to watch you burn." Mary Ann looked at the flames licking at the bottom of the door. She looked at the man she had come to love, not the monster, but the artist who carved hummingbirds in the dark. "No," she said. She walked to the kitchen. She grabbed the massive cast-iron skillet, the one too heavy for a normal woman to lift with one hand. She gripped it until her knuckles turned white. "Open the door." "Boone," she commanded. "What?" "I said open it. They think we're trapped. They think we're weak. Open the door and shoot the first thing that isn't me." Boone stared at her. He saw something in her face he had never seen in a human being before. It wasn't just courage. It was a terrifying maternal rage. He reached up and slid the bolt back. Mary Ann kicked the door open. The fire on the porch was growing, but through the flames, she saw Pike. He was standing close, preparing to throw another torch. He grinned when he saw her, thinking she was surrendering. Finally, he spat. "Come out and—" He never finished the sentence. Mary Ann charged. She didn't run, she thundered. She moved with the momentum of a runaway freight train. She burst through the flames, ignoring the heat, singing her skirts. Pike raised his gun, but he was too slow. Mary Ann swung the cast-iron skillet with every ounce of her body weight behind it. Clang. The sound rang out like a church bell. The skillet connected with the side of Pike's head. He didn't even scream. He simply folded, crumpling into the snow like a marionette with cut strings. The remaining hired gun, the one who hadn't been burned, raised his rifle at her. Bang! Boone's shot took him in the shoulder, spinning him around. He dropped his weapon and ran, disappearing into the blizzard, leaving his boss unconscious in the snow. Mary Ann stood panting in the storm, the skillet still in her hand. The fire on the porch hissed and spat. She looked down at Pike. He was alive, groaning, but he wouldn't be waking up anytime soon. She turned back to the cabin. Boone was propped up in the doorway, his face pale as death, but his eyes wide with awe. "I told you," she said, her voice breaking as the adrenaline faded and the cold rushed in. "I am heavy, Mr. Calloway, and I am very hard to move." Then, for the first time in her life, Mary Ann Higgins fainted. Consciousness returned to Mary Ann slowly, wrapped in a haze of warmth and the scent of wood smoke. The biting cold of the blizzard was gone, replaced by a heavy, comforting heat that seemed to radiate from the very mattress beneath her. She blinked her eyes open, expecting the rough ceiling of the guest loft. Instead, She saw sturdy beams of dark timber and felt the weight of a thick fur quilt tucked securely around her shoulders. She was in the main bedroom, Boone's sanctuary. The air smelled of him, rich pine resin, cured tobacco, and the crisp, clean scent of snow. She tried to shift her position, but a dull ache radiated through her shoulder, the ghost of the shotgun's recoil, and her arms felt heavy, as if her muscles had turned to lead. It was a good kind of pain, though, the pain of survival. "Easy now," a rough voice murmured. Mary Ann turned her head. Boone was there. He was sitting in a crude wooden chair pulled right up to the bedside, his injured leg propped awkwardly on a stool and swathed in fresh white bandages. He looked exhausted, the lines around his eyes deepened by pain and worry, his skin pale beneath the beard. But he wasn't looking at the door or the rifle leaning against the wall. He was watching her. His large hand rested on the quilt, just inches from her own, as if he were guarding a pile of gold dust. "How long?" she rasped, her throat dry. "Since dawn." "It's nearly noon now," Boone said softly. "You went down hard, Mary Ann." "Like a felled oak, did I?" "Is he?" The memory of the violence washed over her, the fire, the roar of the gun, the sickening crunch of cast iron against bone. "Cornelius Pike is alive," Boone reassured her, his voice grim but satisfied. "Though he'll likely be eating soup for the rest of his days." The sheriff rode up with a posse at first light, saw the smoke. They found Pike half frozen in a drift, and his hired gun crying about a broken shoulder. "They're in a cell in Purgatory Springs now." Mary Ann let out a shuddering breath, the tension leaving her body so suddenly she felt lightheaded. "It's over?" "It's over," Boone confirmed. "They won't be back. Pike's reputation is shattered, beaten by a woman with a skillet." A small, jagged smile touched his lips. "The town will be dining out on that story for 50 years. Mary Ann felt a flush rise to her cheeks, but for the first time in her life, it wasn't from shame. "I was angry," she whispered, looking down at her hands that were broad, scarred, and capable. "I didn't think. I just saw the fire, and I saw you bleeding." "You charged a gunman," Boone interrupted, his tone shifting from amusement to something fiercely intense. He leaned forward, ignoring the wince of pain from his leg. "You walked through fire for me, Mary Ann." "You would have done the same," she countered. "I'm supposed to," Boone growled, looking away, his gaze fixing on the flickering flames in the hearth. "I'm the monster, the butcher. Violence is what I was made for. But you." He looked back at her, his dark eyes shimmering with an emotion she had never seen there before. Vulnerability. "I have to tell you something," he said, his voice rough with unshed emotion. "The temper, the stories, they weren't all lies. Not in the beginning." Mary Ann stayed silent, sensing the weight of the confession coming. "I came up to this mountain because I hated the world," Boone admitted. "I hated how they looked at me. A giant, a freak, too big for a normal life, too ugly to be loved. I was angry at God for making me this way. I shouted. I broke things. I drove people away because it was easier to be the villain they expected than the man I was." He reached out, his calloused fingers hesitating before gently covering her hand. "When you wrote that letter, I thought it was a joke or a mistake. I went to the station intending to scare you off, to growl and glare until you ran back to the train, just like the others." "Why didn't you?" Mary Ann asked softly. "Because when you stepped off that train," Boone said, his thumb tracing the knuckles she had bruised on the intruder, "I didn't see a frightened girl. I saw someone who carried a burden just as heavy as mine. I saw the way you held your head up even when they stared. I saw dignity." Tears pricked Mary Ann's eyes. "I felt like an elephant, Boone. I always have. Too much space, too much noise, too much everything." "Stop it," Boone commanded. But the harshness was gone, replaced by a desperate sincerity. "You listen to me, Mary Ann Higgins. You are not an elephant. You are the mountain." The words hung in the warm air, solid and true. A mountain isn't just big, Boone continued, his voice cracking. A mountain withstands the storm. It shelters the valley. It endures when everything else breaks. Last night, I was ready to die on that floorboards. But you held me up. You were the only thing strong enough to carry me. He leaned in closer, his face inches from hers. I fell in love with you the day you didn't flinch when I yelled. I fell in love with you when you filled this empty, silent house with the smell of bread. And last night, when you stood in that doorway with a shotgun, I realized I'm not the butcher of Bear Ridge anymore. I'm just Mary Ann's husband. And that is the only title I have ever wanted. I love you, Boone, she whispered, the confession spilling out of her like a river breaking a dam. I love your hands. I love your scars. I love the man who carves hummingbirds in the dark. Boone closed the distance between them. He kissed her, and it wasn't the desperate, salty kiss of survival they had shared in the kitchen. It was slow, deep, and reverent. It was a kiss that tasted of promise. His beard scratched softly against her cheek, his hand cradling her face as if she were made of the finest, most precious porcelain. In that moment, Mary Ann didn't feel heavy. She felt anchored. She felt found. 6 months later, the harsh white of winter had retreated to the highest peaks, leaving the Bighorn foothills awash in a riot of spring color. Wildflowers, Indian paintbrush and lupine carpeted the meadow in splashes of red and purple. On the front porch of the Calloway cabin, the charred wood had been replaced with fresh, golden pine. And there, in the afternoon sun, sat a new addition. It was a rocking chair. But not just any chair. It was a masterpiece of craftsmanship, built from solid oak, with a seat wide enough to be truly comfortable and sturdy enough to last a lifetime. The backrest was intricately carved, with a relief of winding vines and blooming mountain laurels. Mary Ann sat in it, shelling peas into a ceramic bowl. The chair rocked smoothly, silently, holding her weight with an easy grace. She hummed a tune, her feet resting on the warm planks. She wore a dress of bright blue calico, the fabric specifically ordered from the East, tailored to fit her curves rather than hide them. From the barn, the rhythmic thwack-thwack of an axe splitting wood echoed. Boone was working in the yard. He moved with a slight, permanent limp, now a souvenir of the long winter, but his strength was undiminished. A wagon rattled up the muddy trail, the mule's ears twitching at the flies. It was Billy, the delivery boy from town, bringing the monthly supplies of sugar and coffee. He pulled on the reins, looking nervous as Boone straightened up, wiping sweat from his brow. The scar on Boone's temple was still there, silver against his tan skin, but the wild, unkempt beard was trimmed neat. "Afternoon, Mr. Calloway," Billy squeaked, his eyes darting to the massive axe. "Afternoon, Billy," Boone called back. His voice still boomed like thunder in a canyon, but the malice was gone. Billy looked up at the porch. "Afternoon, Mrs. Calloway. That's a mighty fine chair." "It is, isn't it?" Mary Ann beamed, running her hand over the carved armrest. "My husband made it. He says a queen needs a proper throne." Boone snorted from the yard, but the tips of his ears turned pink. He walked up the steps, the floorboards groaning familiarly under his boots. He didn't say a word to the boy. He simply walked to his wife, resting his heavy hand on her shoulder. He looked down at her, the woman who had saved his life, the woman who had filled the silence. Mary Ann reached up, covering his large, rough hand with her own soft one. She squeezed it, and he squeezed back. The town still talked, of course. They told stories about the giant and his warrior bride. They whispered about the skillet and the shotgun. But they didn't call him the butcher anymore. And they certainly didn't call her the elephant. They called them the Calloways. And up here, where the air was thin and the earth was wild, that was the only name that mattered. What a journey. From a terrified mail-order bride stepping onto a dusty platform to a warrior woman defending her home with a cast-iron skillet, Marianne Higgins proved that true strength has nothing to do with size and everything to do with heart. And Boone Calloway? He showed us that the scariest monsters are often just broken men waiting for someone brave enough to heal them. This story reminds us that love isn't about finding someone perfect. It's about finding the person who fits your broken pieces. If you enjoyed this tale of the Wild West, please smash that like button. It really helps the channel grow. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon so you never miss a story. Share this video with someone who needs a reminder that they are worthy of love exactly as they are. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.